May I start? Joe Feinberg is one of the organizers of the conference, right? Or co-organizers, and he's a member of the Department for the Study of Modern Czech Philosophy, and he's focused mainly on Czech Marxist humanism, dissident movement and dissident philosophy, and the theory of populism and anti-populism. Am I right? Yeah, that's what I found on the web page. Joe will deliver the paper titled 1989, The Victory of Philosophy and the Loss of Criticism. Joe, floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. James was a little bit concerned before this, but I actually think that our two papers go together well, and I think without having planned ahead of time or even planned the coincidence in our vocabulary and our titles, in some sense what I'm going to try to do here will be to explain how one side of James's story became conceptually possible. That is the side of those who became the intellectual leaders of the new discourse that emerged at the end of 1989 and early 1990 that came to narrow the range of what socialism could mean and what democracy could mean. And I want to contrast that with what was emerging both within dissident circles, which I'll talk about to some extent, but also with what James described outside of the specific dissident circles, which I'd like you to keep in mind as I go on. But the way I decided to frame this was by pointing to a certain contradiction that appears, I think, to the average outside observer who might come to 1989, say, in 50 years, not having particular commitments to any one of the sides or other, not knowing a lot about it. But if you come and follow what's happening, read the basic outlines of the history, and particularly the intellectual history, and read some of the interesting works that are emerging both before and after. What we see happening is, on the one hand, there is an emerging level of prestige that suddenly is given on a public level to philosophy, or something that we could call philosophy on a symbolic level, maybe broadly considered the value of the public intellectual, which could be seen, for example, in the new publication of a large body of works of philosophers, especially dissident philosophers who hadn't been able to publish before November 1989 or had limited opportunities to publish. But also prominent dissident philosophers would take up important posts, for example, in academic administration, with Radim Palouš, philosopher, becoming the rector of Charles University, and in politics, most famously, the philosopher-playwright Václav Havel becoming president who is almost understood to be a sort of philosopher king, of course in the model of the great Czechoslovak tradition of Masaryk, a great tradition which has exactly two representatives. But that's maybe all you need for tradition. Maybe there will be a future one after the next revolution. So this, on the one hand, the prestige of philosophy, and at the same time, what I think can be fairly described as an absence, a relatively sudden absence of social criticism regarding developments following the revolution. That is, the absence of precisely what is typically seen as a major task of publicly engaged philosophers. So even though the revolution was widely understood to be understood as something like the realization of an intellectual project that under exceedingly difficult conditions had developed a vibrant critical tradition leading up to November 1989, and which had been precisely developed this critical apparatus aimed at criticizing the potential and the limits of participation in politics. Suddenly there emerges this new intellectual class whose major aim, or say major public activity, is largely focused on criticizing the critics of the new regime. Of course, after revolutions, it's not that this is an entirely new phenomenon or surprising phenomenon. Nonetheless, I think it's worth asking, how did such a critical anti-statist philosophy or set of philosophies, philosophical stances in communication with one another, born in dissent, come to be something of a state philosophy that aimed at criticizing enemies of the state project as the primary aim of criticism? Maybe this is depending on who is in the audience, this might be something that some of you will raise in the period of questioning and criticism. But what I think that we can see is that there is, of course, not a complete disappearance of criticism, but a narrowing of the range of criticism, of what belongs within the frame of what should be the object of criticism, and what lies after the transformation outside of the frame of criticism. Or to put it in other terms, it's often said that revolutions devour their children, but I think this can only happen if the revolution actually gives birth to a litter of children with competing visions and demands, a number of critics, in other words, who are critics not only of the revolution's enemies, but also of the revolution itself, and therefore can be children worth eating. So what kind of philosophical delicacy was so unworthy of being devoured? And this, I'll just briefly offer a comparison of the situation after 1989 to the situation after 1948, to bring up yet another of these major terms. It hasn't been the primary point of orientation today, but in many ways we can see 1948 as being intimately connected to 1968, in that the generation of 48 was largely the generation of those critics who came to prominence in the 1960s, who were people who had believed in the 48 revolution and were enthusiastic about it at the time, and then became some of its greatest critics as they became disappointed in its failure to fulfill its promises. Whereas after 1989, although James pointed out, I think this a very interesting statistic, that on the rank and file level in 1989 was in many ways the work of the generation of 68, so no longer the generation of 48, which is active publicly in speaking and publishing in 1968, but now the generation of those who were young in 1968 are active in 1989, and many of the dissidents also are people who had come of age in one way or another in 1968. But following 1989, so far, I don't think we can see anything comparable taking place. 10 years after the revolution, the leading intellectuals are already out of office, most of them cut off from what positions of power they might have held earlier. Most are disappointed with the new state of affairs, frustrated and angry, but they never become leading critics of the regime as such. Rather, they blame various flaws in the structure of the regime that is problematized by corruption or the immaturity of politicians, the immaturity of the masses who haven't learned democracy, and so on. These are the kinds of discursive turns of phrase that we hear in 10 years after the revolution. And even 20 years after the revolution, when criticism becomes more vocal in the Czech public sphere, we still don't hear, it's still not the generation of '89 that tends to be among the leading representatives of criticism. It's in many ways a new generation that comes and makes the more radical, takes the radical position of critique, whereas the generation of '89 is much more hesitant and maybe eventually comes to sympathize a bit with the critical position, but nothing like in the 1960s where they become the foremost critics. As a general rule, of course, I'm moving at the level of grand generalizations, that all of which can be nuanced and criticized. So maybe this is another nuance of the meaning also of this slogan that 89 is 68 turned upside down. 68 as a failed revolution or failed transformation led to a new creative phase of radical critique, whereas 1989, successful on one level, led to a kind of affirmation that actually negated many of the movements, much of the movement's critical potential, or at least narrowed the field of critical possibility. So now I would like to go back a little bit and look at that field of critical possibility that was opening up throughout the period after 1968 and during the events of November and 1989, which then became foreclosed in many ways. So when we ask what the legacy is, I think we can come back to this at the end. I think it's an open question of whether the legacy means the legacy of that potential that was opened up at various moments, or is it the legacy of the foreclosure of potential that seems historically to be one of the major results of the actual event, the actual moment as a turning point in history. So going back to before 1989, there's dissident thought, I think, really is a good place to look at the mixed legacy that's full of tension, whereas popular thought, insofar as James described it, in many ways was, well, there are other contradictions between, say, one version of socialism and another conception of socialism that pushed up against one another, but then seemed to have a relatively consistent attitude at the moment of the revolution. Well, we could discuss how consistent it becomes as it also changes. But the dissidents, I think, also reveal a specific tension with their approach to criticism and what criticism can mean. This is maybe also a moment I'll just open up the point of comparison with 68 in France and what that led to versus 68 in Prague and Czechoslovakia, what that led to, a major question that others can take further later on. But I think we can see that whereas the partial failure of May 68 in Paris led to a kind of reharnessing of revolutionary energy into new intellectual projects that were very powerfully described in the first panel today. Whereas in Prague, there was, at least at the outset, an almost total loss of enthusiasm after 1968. So the new generation of thinkers are people who had never placed very many hopes in 1948, not people who were disappointed in 48, disappointed in the unfulfilled promises of socialism, but those who were able to either say that they had never believed it in the first place, or who were able to reformulate themselves and their own thinking in order to say that wasn't a hope that they should have had in the first place. Which doesn't mean that they were anti-socialist as such, and I think we can see that all the way up till November 1989, and even gradually after that, there are still voices of many, even dissidents, who become self-identified right-wing oriented or conservative thinkers who still, up through the end of 1989, have positive ideas about socialism in one way or another. And yet there's something that's happening in the course of this shift from the thinking of the Prague Spring to the thinking, or the renaissance of socialism, to the thinking of 1989. One of the major points, which is actually a point that's similar in France and in Czechoslovakia and in many other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, is this disappointment with state politics and renunciation of the state as the center for public engagement. And as these leading voices of what comes to be known gradually as dissent, especially after 1977 and the formation of the group around Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, there's this new emphasis on the need for people to emancipate themselves without relying on a party or a state structure. So the Marxist humanist principles of egalitarianism and self-management are in many ways retained in this new impulse of thought, but they're reshaped as the dissidents experiment with new modes of being together. And it's interesting that in the great variety of thinking that comes out of this, this was received with great enthusiasm in the West, but I think James is right to say that even the Westerners loved reading that there were people in Eastern and Central Europe who were critical of their regimes. It was much harder, I think, for Westerners to understand their thought as being something sui generis. They tended to understand it within one of the frameworks. I mean, the liberals tended to understand them as if they were liberals, advocating, when they said democracy, that means liberal capitalist democracy. And then the left tended to latch on to the dissidents who still adhered more explicitly to leftist ideas and put them into the framework of what the already established leftist ideas had been. Though there were a few attempts to take up civil society, the dissident idea of civil society, as being a major new creative impulse, that actually the impulse came from thinkers in Eastern Europe and was really taken up with enthusiasm in the West, and then actually reapplied to Eastern European and Central European dissidents, often many of whom actually didn't use the concept. And so we have this phenomenon where someone like John Keane was a British leftist political philosopher who would write about Václav Havel and the other Czechs within the framework of the idea of civil society, which was not actually an idea that the Czechs used with any great frequency until after November 1989. But there was this creative impulse, but it was directed into specific ways that I think would prove, would not necessarily predetermine the outcome of 1989, but would prove fateful in a certain sense. So one of the things that happened was that there's this new attention to being together outside of state and party politics brought with it a turn to ethics and then to ontology, being together, the problem of being itself. This was a great broadening of philosophical perspectives. It brought a kind of new political meaning to philosophical approaches that hadn't been highly developed in a lot of Marxist currents, and then the non-Marxist currents hadn't developed it as political philosophy to such an extent. But then there's something that starts happening, that while these dissidents give up on the state for social change, gradually they start giving up in some other sense on the people. They give up, of course, on attempts to emphasize the proletariat, the working class, but also on the notion of society, which gradually drops out of the majority, let's say that the mainstream of the dissidents. Of course, complicated notion itself. And one crucial result is the way that the notion of solidarity is reconstructed within especially Czech dissident thought. So, in one formal respect, the dissidents' emphasis on human rights, which became a major point throughout Communist Party-ruled countries, it maintained the earlier Marxist humanist promise of an all-human solidarity. But the notion of human rights also, in another sense, could serve to narrow the scope of solidarity because it drew attention to the rights of those people whose rights were not respected in a given case. So it was a sort of negative solidarity that was invoked to aid the minority of people who in a given moment most needed solidarity. But it wasn't, it was this, the constant of continual solidarity with all of humanity began to drop out of, or drop away from the center of dissident thought. And figures like the poor or the exploited would drop out of the scope of solidarity. They would move to the margins, let's say. And then in principle, the leading voices of dissidents would also call for a retreat from politics, which then meant a certain the notion of solidarity also created a kind of political divide, because solidarity was appropriate for people who were on let's say, the right side of politics, but it became much more complicated what solidarity meant for people who are on the other side of politics. On the one hand, we can see the outcome of this emphasis towards like the ethical forgiving of one's other and one's enemy, which James pointed to as on a theatrical scale in 1989. But we also have critics within the dissident movement. The fact that they exist as critics within the movement shows that this was an undercurrent, but at the same time shows that they were a minority within, or felt themselves to be a minority within the movement. And so this is, I just want to read a quote from Petr Rezek, who was a dissident, famously critical of his fellow dissidents. And he points to the notion of the parallel polis that Václav Benda developed. Referring to that, Rezek says, "The parallel community did not extend its message to humanity as such, but only to those whom it called shaken. It took the notion of the shaken from Jan Patočka, who employed it in his heretical essays in an entirely different context. The solidarity of the shaken, that is Patočka's, this Patočkian notion. Patočka being a great Czech philosopher who was an early signatory of Charter 77 and died before the major sort of outgrowth of dissident movements in the late 70s, well, especially in the 80s. So, to continue the quote, Patočka reflected on the shakenness that was experienced by some participants in World War I that led them to come together with their enemies on the other side of the battle lines. But according to Rezek, Patočka's dissident followers precluded solidarity with those who pursue them, those who oppress them. There's only solidarity with those who are shaken, not with the shakers, I guess. So he raised the problem. What is solidarity with everyone else? And so this narrowing of the field of solidarity, I think, reflects a more general narrowing of social outlook, and which I think doesn't necessarily discredit the other sides of dissident thought. And we can now I won't get into the great variety that there was, but we can point to the ways in which this principled retreat from society could have been understood as not necessarily a retreat from the social as a concept. It could have been seen as a tactical retreat. We aren't able to be active in the public sphere as freely as we would like, so we create an alternative sphere that could be this tactical retreat, and then we move back into public and back into society. And there was also this notion of the prefigurative or the anticipatory democracy was a notion of Adam Michnik in Poland that could have been conceived as taking these specific, local, select practices that we develop in our community and then generalizing them. And so if we imagine ourselves standing in say, early November 1989 among the dissidents, it's by no means clear yet, I think, which direction new developments would take dissident thought. But this is why the notion of 1989, even though I think we can also question the meaning of the event when looking at these events as a philosophical point, but according to some notions, the event, 89, was certainly a great event in modern history, and so insofar as it shook the foundations of critical thought and arguably of social organization in large parts of the world. But in hindsight, it can also be seen as a kind of non-event, in the sense that the great ideas that then became retrospectively associated with 1989, the ideas of civil society and democracy, were in many ways represent the negation and curtailing of the thought that was developed by the dissidents in the years before. So I think Habermas's dismissive remarks that James pointed to, they're clearly wrong if we take them at face value. The revolutionaries were not without new ideas, but the new ideas were lost in some ways in the course of the revolution. And so it became true what Habermas said, which wasn't, I think, true when he wrote it, but it sort of became true, and maybe can become false again if we return to this legacy in new ways. But there was this idea, or this understanding of this as being the event that canceled out the need for future events. This idea of the end of history is also an idea of the end of events. There's no more need for rupture. This event was only necessary because of an unfortunate earlier event 40 years before that had made it necessary to undo this event. And so we have this narrowing of the idea that another one of the great dissident principles was this opening up, this idea that we don't have specific political or social prescriptions because anything should be possible. Giving way to the 1990s idea that there is no alternative. This is the only, on a social level, the only way that we can move forward. So this critical stance becomes redirected into a kind of moral stance and civic stance. So there's a community, the critical intellectual becomes conceptualized as the moral individual who is able to morally judge politicians, but also morally judge the people who elect them. And then the idea of democracy, again, becomes simplified, I think, from the much more complex idea of democracy we have up through the end of 1989. Now, just a couple of final thoughts. So what I want to ask is whether there might be another legacy that looks back to 1989 and sees if it's possible for us to see 1989 no longer as a legacy of the closing off of alternatives, which one result that the actualization of revolutionary ideals always entails, but also reassessing the possibilities that weren't realized. One very final thought, though, since today we've been talking a lot about events, I want to just ask whether the notion of the event, if we understand 1989 as an event, whether this idea of being faithful to the event that Alain Badiou has so popularized is adequate for attempts to go back to events and resurrect something that was covered over, foreclosed, forgotten, or if we might need instead to be, in some sense, unfaithful to the event and not develop the event as a new credo that one should be faithful to, but as something that we should be treacherous to in some ways as we look for alternatives. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe, and I think we can start a discussion.